rise with me. This is our tradition. If you're able, rise and let respect for God's Word. I'll be reading today from Genesis, 45th chapter, the first 15 verses, as we continue in Pastor Jeff's sermon series from Genesis. Joseph could no longer control himself in front of his attendants. So he declared, "Everyone leave now." So no one stayed with him when he revealed his identity to his brothers. He wept so loudly that the Egyptians and Pharaoh's household heard him. Joseph said to his brothers, "I'm Joseph. Is my father really still alive?" His brothers couldn't respond because they were terrified before him. Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they moved closer. He said, "I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold to Egypt. Now don't be upset and don't be angry with yourself that you sold me here. Actually, God sent me before you to save lives. We've already had 2 years of famine in the land, and there are 5 years left without planting or harvesting. God sent me before you to make sure you'd survive and to rescue your lives in this amazing way. You didn't send me here. It was God who made me a father to Pharaoh, master of his entire household, and ruler of the whole land of Egypt. Hurry, go back to your father. Tell him this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me master of all Egypt. Come down to me. Don't delay. You may live in the land of Goshen, so you will be near me, your children, your grandchildren, your flocks, your herds, and everyone with you. I will support you there, so you, your household, and everyone with you won't starve, since the famine will still last 5 years. You, my brother Benjamin, have seen with your own eyes that I am speaking to you. Tell my father about my power in Egypt and about everything you've seen. Hurry and bring my father down here." He threw his arms around his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept on his shoulder. And he kissed all his brothers and wept, embracing them. After that, his brothers were finally able to talk to him. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
I was doing as I have done many times, standing there in front of the judge's bench with a client. Now, for those of you that don't know, I was an attorney, so I guess I should introduce myself as saying, "Hi, I'm Jeff, I was an attorney." So I did family law. I practiced family law. That's where you have those bitter custody battles that are painful for all involved, especially the children, grandparent rights, once in a while a rare adoption that just brings joy to everybody, but mostly it was divorces. And there's always a time before the divorce is what's called finalized, you have to do what's called a prove-up. You have to do a prove-up. There's certain questions that the clients, that the spouses, the parties have to say under oath in front of the judge, state their name, establish their county of residence. If there's any, are there any children of the marriage? Do you believe that the distribution of property is equitable? And you just got to go through these. And then there's the critical question. The critical question. do you have any reasonable expectation of reconciliation? And I asked a critical question. And client started trembling a little bit, a tear comes down his cheek, and he says, yes. The judge wanted to make sure that he heard the question correctly. He says, now, do you believe you have a reasonable expectation of reconciliation, even though his spouse had already answered no? And he said, yes, if we could just have more time and if we'll just work out more, yes. Now, on the one hand, as an attorney, you really don't want that to be the answer after you've gone through all this in front of the judge, taking the judge's time. You know, and most of the time, in family law, you just hope that the parties, the spouses, will come to a point in their life that they realize they're not really enemies. And so what you hope, and except for cases of abuse, because that's a whole different category, you know, I was thinking about it. The client, he gave the answer that we really should give. Should we? In all aspects of life. Do you have an expectation of reconciliation? Yes. Yes, it's God's people. It's God's people who believe, have a conviction in the goodness of God, that people are created in God's image. We should have a reasonable expectation of reconciliation in situations. And with the belief that we are created by a loving God, created to love each other. There should be this expectation. Today's story is a story of reconciliation. It's a story as we are actually ending our sermon series today on Genesis, which is about beginnings. We call it Genesis the book, not the band, though the band is really good. The band is good. Genesis the book, not the band. As we end, we're ending it with a story how all stories should end. This way. Reconciliation. So we have a story here with Joseph. Joseph, we introduced to him last week. He has these dreams of power. He's a dreamer. He has these dreams of power. His brothers, he has 11 brothers. They're all sons of Jacob. 11 brothers, they want to kill him. They take him out to the middle of nowhere. But Benjamin talks about killing Joseph, and they just throw him in a pit. The last time they've seen their brother, they left him in a pit. Now he is rescued. He is rescued. A caravan comes, and a lot has happened between chapter 37 and chapter 45. If you didn't get a chance to read it during the week, I invite you to read it this week, so you can get the whole story. But he gets rescued. They sell him to slavery in Egypt. He gets a job, but then gets fired. He's thrown in prison. But Joseph is a dreamer, and he has a special gift of interpreting dreams. So Pharaoh, the leader of Egypt, the ruler, the king of Egypt, called him, and he's been having these weird dreams, and Joseph is able to interpret. Says there's this famine coming, so we need to prepare. We need to start storing this grain. And Joseph rises up in power. He becomes the Secretary of Agriculture, let's say, and really second in command. And he has all this power and control over all these riches. And there's a severe famine in the land, and so his brothers come from there to try to come and get some help, to receive, get a handout, get some government subsidy, and they're there. And this is his first encounter since he left going in pit. And what's he do? Here's his opportunity, isn't it? They don't know it's him, but he knows it's them. He has this opportunity for revenge. He could use his power for revenge. He could make that dream that he had of all of his brothers bowing down to him just come true. But he does something different. He does something different. Now, between that first encounter and the encounter that Bill just read to us that we have today, there's some finagling that goes on. But it finally gets to the point of what we read. Of what we read, and how he used his power. And it says, he finally rebels. He says, I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold to Egypt. Now, don't be upset. Don't be angry with yourselves. And then they embrace. He kissed all his brothers. They wept. They are embracing. There's this weeping. There's this hugging. There's this, the crying. And here is Joseph, who was harmed, hurt the offendee that now offers forgiveness. He doesn't demand restitution. Restitution gets some compensation for the harm that was done to you. He doesn't seek revenge. He offers forgiveness. And, forgiveness sounds good in the abstract, doesn't it? But in reality, it's kind of a little offensive, isn't it? To think that he would do this at this point. Even with this depth of injustice and the immense harm that was done, that he offers reconciliation. Reconciliation provides an opportunity for a new way of moving forward. Reconciliation provides an opportunity for a new way of moving forward. And so he now provides this opportunity, a new way of moving forward for him, for his brothers, for his father, for the relationship of all, and for God's people. Provides this opportunity of a new way moving forward. Because even on the depth of injustice that he had, I think that kind of the question in his mind changed. Instead of, as sometimes we say, well, why me? Why is this happening to me? The question, I think, changes for Joseph when his brothers and Mary's go, okay, what does God require of me now? What does God require of me now? And the answer comes, and he follows it, and he offers this reconciliation to where now this story ends, as all stories should end, or at least could end, with reconciliation. Throughout this sermon series, we've left some stories without that ending. We've encountered a lot of stories. We've left some stories without that ending, like Jacob and Esau. Jacob and Esau, they were twins. They were Isaac was their dad, Rebekah their mom. They were twins. They started fighting in the womb. Jacob has to be ahead. He wants everything. He ends up getting the birthright of the oldest. In other words, he's going to have all the inheritance. He cheats Esau out of the blessing of the father to become head of the household. And finally, Esau had enough and vows to kill his brother. He wants to kill Jacob. Jacob decides he's going to go off. He lives with his uncle for 14 years. Marries his two cousins. It was a lot back then. Marries his two cousins. And throughout these years, he amasses great wealth. 2 wives, 12 children, servants, large wealth, huge flock. And then finally, he's ready to return to his homeland. And it's on his way back that he's camped out at that brook. We talked about it a couple weeks ago, where he wrestles, like wrestling with God. And it finally gets to the point where the person says, "Who are you?" And Jacob has to admit who he is. All those years of treachery, deceit, and cheating that he engaged in with his brother and his uncle and others just come upon him. He says, "This is who I am." And God says, no more. Now you're going to be one who strives with God. And there's this reconciliation. Jacob reconciling, I think, with himself. Reconciling with God. There's an opportunity, this providing an opportunity for a new way forward. And on the way, there's still, what about Esau? Is he still angry? So he sends gifts, and some of his flock ahead with these, and his servants with these gifts to help assuage Esau's anger. So he's doing restitution. Trying to give some compensation for the harm he's done, because Jacob, unlike Joseph, he's the offender. He's the one who's caused the harm. And perhaps he thinks also that he can help Esau be restored, to give him what he would have had Jacob not cheated him. So there's this restitution and restoration happening. And then he gets there. He sees Esau off in the distance, coming to him with 400 men, an army. Jacob thinking that they're coming with swords and spears, they're going to, with a battle cry, to do battle. So Jacob approaching, he now humbles himself. As he wanted control and power and everything that Esau has, he now puts himself, and it says he bowed down 7 times approaching, as a sign of humility. There's Jacob probably with all that pride, having to put all that pride aside. Hard thing to do. Having to put aside the fear that maybe he would be rejected. Hard thing to do. But does that. And then it says that Esau ran to him, threw his arms around his neck, kissed him, and they wept. And here you have this wonderful scene of reconciliation, where Jacob comes and offers himself in humility, and Esau extends his forgiveness. And here we have this opportunity, this moment, providing an opportunity for a new way forward. And this story, the story of Jacob and Esau, after all those years, means as probably every story should end, or at least could end. And then we had a story where we didn't have that nice ending for Abraham and Hagar. Hagar was the servant for Sarah, and Abraham and Sarah weren't able to have children. So Sarah says, here's Hagar, since she has to bear a child against her will, and everything that's involved with it, against her will. She's treated harshly. She has a son, gives a son, they call him Ishmael. Finally, Sarah is able to have a son, they call him Isaac. Okay, one day there's a gathering, there's a party, Ishmael is laughing. Sarah gets all upset, she's outraged. She demands that Abraham exile, kick Hagar out. This person who was a slave, a servant, who had been exploited, now out on their own, not knowing about life, would even survive. Can you imagine? So, and Bill, I appreciate this. Bill mentioned to me after we talked about that story that rabbinic tradition says that after Sarah died, Abraham invited Hagar back. Now, it makes me think, why are we so much ready to forgive in the face of death than we are ready to forgive in life? In Genesis 25:1, it says, after Sarah died, Abraham married another wife named Keturah. Or rabbinic tradition says that's Hagar. And here he is, the reconciliation, they marry, they have other children. And now that story, providing a new way forward, it is ending as all stories should or could end. Some of you may know the name Ken Burns. Does, yeah, a lot of documentaries, right? I just recently discovered he has a documentary on baseball. I'm looking forward to seeing it. That's not relevant to the sermon. Is his documentary on the Civil War. And I love the way that Frederick Buechner, in his book, The Remarkable Ordinary, kind of describes what happens. And it's the scene. It's kind of a devastating scene. It's the scene about the 50th anniversary of the battle at Gettysburg, where there's going to be a reenactment. So all these veteran soldiers, 50 years later, gather there in Gettysburg. And they're there and they're, swapping stories, drinking beer, but then finally the time comes. So these older veterans of the Union Army, the ones who can still walk, they make their way up the hill. And the film, it's kind of this, it's the flickering light and, grainy film that sometimes it's hard to make out. But then you have the Confederate soldiers making their way on to the battlefield. Those who could walk and those who couldn't are assisted by being lifted under the arm. And the time comes for the fierce battle. The Confederate soldiers start marching, a few rebel cries, and then you hear the groans from the Union Army up on the hill as they try to make their way down. They get down on the field, they're ready for the fierce battle, and instead they just embrace one another. They shake hands, they laugh, they smile, they embrace, they cry. That's 50 years later. They finally realized that they were not enemies. In all these stories, you have the story of Joseph, story of, and his brothers, Jacob and Esau, Abraham and Hagar, and other stories. For reconciliation, whether we're the offendee or the offender, you got to come to realize that we're not enemies. For reconciliation to take place, there needs to be the realization that we are not enemies. Throughout the sermon series on Genesis, the book, not the man, we've had stories, some very rough stories, stories of exploitation, stories of power mongering, stories of jealousy, of hatred, of wanting revenge, stories of oppression. You know, and is it our job to defend those stories? You know, to defend those stories by saying things like, well, that's God's plan, that was God's plan. No, it's not. I don't see it's our job to defend the stories as much as it is to learn from these stories. To learn from these stories and let these stories impact our own stories. And especially these stories about reconciliation. And let them inform and impact and influence our own Genesis, our own stories, our own beginnings, so that our stories will also end the way stories should end, or at least could end.